The way Jay is treated in this fandom infuriates me, as many people treat her like she's simply just a traumatized person with bad coping mechanisms who needs to be shown a little love, Tessa's best friend who would be willing to do anything for her, or someone who's rough around the edges but ultimately cares a lot about the people around her. Yet there's one aspect of her character I always see. People love to conveniently forget that Jay is an abuser, with that part of her only ever being brought up when it can be tacked on to the end of another argument to paint her as a victim. However, when you look at canon, it's plain as day that not only is Jay abusive, but there is nothing and no. Before we get started, I just want to make it clear that this is not a your fave is problematic video. I'm not gonna get up on my soapbox and scream about how you're a bad person for liking Jay. I like Jay. However, I'm also able to acknowledge her treatment of N as abusive, and I think we as a fandom need to do that more often and hold her more accountable. Anyway, sit back, relax, and let's get into the. Within the series, Jay is consistently characterized as cruel and abusive. I'm not taking a single scene and making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not a case of Jay being written as abusive in her first appearance only for that to be retconned out of her character, and it's not a V situation where we simply lack the context to understand her motives and behavior. In the pilot, Jay is shown abusing N by knocking him to the floor and standing on his neck, telling him that he's worthless and terrible, and that if the company allowed it, she would kill him herself. And when we meet her in person for the first time, N is incredibly flighty and nervous around her, realizing he messed up and looking for any excuse possible to get away from her because he fears what she'll do. Right after they break into the bunker, Jay congratulates N on getting in, which, combined with her line of
I never needed either of you.
"an absolute N," suggests that she only respects people who she thinks have value. V defected from their cause, so she's lost all respect for her, and in her eyes, N is weak and worthless, despite being anything but. In that same scene, when N starts to question their purpose and the company's motive for sending them there, Jay sticks him with the virus, acting on a desire she expressed earlier in the episode and most likely harbored for years. And what does N do when he's on the ground dying? He thanks Jay. He thanks Jay for looking out for him, despite the fact she's done nothing but hurt and manipulate him. Jay had done such a good job at frightening Anne into becoming the passive, subservient employee she wanted that even in what could have been his last moments, he thanked her. He thanks her for abusing him, belittling him, and now thanks her for almost killing him. Plus, in the bunker, when Uzi encourages N to speak his mind, he can't even bring himself to make eye contact with anyone. Same in Heartbeat when he interrupts Uzi and prevents her from insulting Eldritch J. N is very clearly traumatized from Jay's treatment of him, used to stroking her ego and repressing opinions he knew she would dislike because he feared being reprimanded. In my video Trauma and Healing, I say that N was so used to being used and abused that he saw the treatment as normal, and while Jay didn't specifically groom him into that mindset, she still reinforced it and didn't do anything. Admittedly, Jay is much less intense with her bullying in the episodes Home and Dead End, and you might think that Liam is trying to backtrack on her abusive behavior, but it makes sense given her character. In N's flashback and Heartbeat, Jay flips from kicking N and insulting him to putting on a sweet voice and acting like nothing happened. And what was the trigger that caused this change? Tessa. In Home, it's shown that Tessa was both friends with Jay and loved N. I highly doubt she would have been too fond of Jay if she learned she hated and abused N, so Jay hides her true nature by acting sweet whenever Tessa is around to avoid getting reprimanded. Jay's abusive behavior being restrained isn't a retcon and doesn't invalidate her previous abusive end, but instead shows how loyal she is to Tessa. And when you really think about it, the fact Jay had to hide her abusive behavior from Tessa because she knew she would dislike it makes you wonder just how healthy their friendship was to begin with. There's a trend within fan spaces where people will latch on to a cruel character so hard that they'll try to ignore their flaws and prop up their positive or sympathetic traits to make them seem like a good person. The traits people will latch on to most often with Jay are her business based humor and her friendship with Tessa, with many people ballooning those traits to make it seem like its entire personality and using them to paper over her abusive behavior. Jay is unquestionably written as abusive in the pilot, as we see a glimpse of both what she does to N and how the behavior affects him, and the early fandom did a good job of holding her accountable and not babying or trying to excuse her. So, what caused the sudden shift from Jay's devil spawn, and if you like her in any capacity, you're an abuse apologist, to actually Jay's an innocent baby who's done nothing wrong? Home. Home admittedly does a lot for Jay's character, as it gives her a personality outside of being an abusive corporate suck up by giving her a friend in Tessa Elliott. And this is when I really started seeing the general opinion of Jay's character change. On one hand, I think this is good, as admittedly, Jay was a bit of a plot device of a character in the early days. However, this also led to an increase of people using her friendship with Tessa to make her treatment of N seem less important. I think this might be a result of how people are taught to see abusers. Most stories that feature abusive characters or real life stories of abuse paint the abuser as a cold hearted, unfeeling monster who only lives to cause misery when that couldn't be farther from the truth. Abusers aren't Saturday morning cartoon villains who spend all their free time plotting how they're going to harm their victims. Abusers are people just like anyone else. They can have lives outside their victims, and most do. Jay can be Tessa's friend and N's abuser. I think a big reason this happens is because people are used to sympathetic villains. Villains who have a tragic backstory that explains their villainy, so they're kind of caught off guard when faced with a character who isn't sympathetic or whose villainous actions outweigh their sympathy. As a result, people try to make them a sympathetic character, which, in the case of characters like Jay, who lack any sympathetic traits, will often result in the creation of a mangled mess of a character who only barely resembles their canon counterpart. This is why I believe so many people were caught off guard with Jay's behavior in the finale. They were so used to the flanderized, sympathetic version of Jay that the fandom created, they forgot that Jay is canonically a massive jerk. And I know what you might be thinking, but Jay does have sympathetic traits, doesn't she? She has trauma from the Elliot Manor. Well, a common argument I see people make in Jay's favor is that the abusive treatment of the Elliots gave her a survival of the fittest mentality that led to her viewing N as useless and weak. While I'm not saying this is impossible, as we don't know much about NV, Jason, and Tessa's day to day lives, a lot of the evidence people use to support this argument is flimsy, and James and Louisa were horrible to everyone. They had no moral qualms with killing drones for infractions as minor as improperly placed silverware, and saw nothing wrong with chaining Tessa to her bedpost as a form of punishment. While we also see Sin and Jay chained up with her, we don't know whether this was a common occurrence or a one time thing due to them already being there and Louisa already being angry. While I imagine having the threat of death constantly hung over you would be stressful and lead to some long lasting trauma, the treatment Jay endured at the hands of the elder Elliots didn't seem much different or worse than anything the other drones or even their own daughter suffered. Firstly, Jay is unbothered in Tessa's presence in episodes 3 and 6. If she knew she was standing next to the rotting corpse of her friend, why would she be so calm? Second, the look of disbelief when Tessa tells her to watch the ship shows that this isn't behavior she would expect from her. Third, Jay's calm and relaxed behavior when referring to Tessa as boss in episode 7, compared to how exasperated and annoyed she acts in episode 8, shows a clear difference in opinion between Tessa and Sin. Fourth, Jay's line
It tricked you! If I promised you anything! It tricked me
of in episode 8 all but confirms the Tessa disguise worked on her as well. She wasn't some innocent sheep being led to the slaughter by a cruel undead shepherd. Up until episode 8, Jay fully believed she was working with and for Tessa. Any trauma she had relating to her death, she would have gained after episode 8, thus meaning it would have no bearing on her behavior during the events of season 1. Once again, I'm not saying Jay having Elliot trauma is impossible, just unlikely. And even if you could find a piece of evidence that proves without a doubt that Jay has trauma from her time at the Elliot Manor and that's why she developed her abusive behavior, it ultimately doesn't matter. An abuser having trauma or a reason behind their abuse doesn't make their behavior not abusive. Like I said, abusers are people and people are complicated. However, there is another justification people commonly make for Jay's behavior, and that's the idea that she's jealous of the affection Anne receives from Tessa. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, I hate this idea. It's the same as the trauma argument, but even worse because it doesn't have any basis in canon. When Tessa picks up Anne and spins him around, Jay just stares ahead with a blank expression on her face. Nothing she says or does suggests she feels any malice towards Anne because of the attention he receives from Tessa. If jealousy were meant to be an even implied part of Jay's character, it wouldn't have been hard to use her expression or body language to convey that. Have her look angry or sad to suggest she's upset Tessa doesn't treat her the same way. Yet she doesn't do anything even remotely similar to that, instead just standing and staring. Once again, like with the trauma thing, Jay being jealous of N technically isn't impossible, just highly unlikely given what we're shown, and if we were meant to interpret it, it would have been a detail the animators would have included. With all of the evidence stacked against Jay that she's abusive, you might wonder why so many people will try to argue in defense of her. Well, I think I have the answer. It's because she's a girl. Statistically, men are more likely to be abusers and women more likely to be victims. So when the dynamic is flipped on its head, with a female abuser and a male victim, less people tend to recognize the woman as an abuser. However, the interesting thing with Jay is that she was originally conceived as a guy. This is entering borderline conspiracy theory territory, but I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons Jay's gender was changed was so that people could take her character seriously without her abusive behavior overshadowing her other traits. If this was the case, then it might have been a bit too effective. This isn't just a problem within the Murder Drones fandom, but fan spaces and really society as a whole. People are used to the idea of all women being goody two-shoes who can do no wrong, and all men being Anakin Skywalkers destined for evil. As a result, cases of abuse with a female perpetrator are generally taken less seriously than cases with a male perpetrator. I really hate to pull the gender card here, but if Jay were still a guy and nothing changed about her characterization or the way she was written, then she'd probably be a much more controversial, if not straight up hated character. She wouldn't be seen as a nuanced and complicated woman, but instead just another evil man. It's easy to cry nuance and look at even the smallest scenes to try to extrapolate depth from your favorite characters, but the thing is, Jay simply doesn't have that nuance. She doesn't have the complicated morals of Doll, the misguided motivations of V, or the dead wife trauma of Khan. Jay is a character with three traits: business, liking Tessa, and hating N. No matter how you look at it, Jay is not nuanced, she's not sympathetic, and she is an abuser. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this video and think that you have to hate Jay or disassociate yourself from anyone who does like her. I just want to see more people hold Jay accountable for her behavior without, in the same breath, trying to make her sound like a victim. Anyway, thanks for watching. Leave your rebuttals in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next time.